So, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Earth Day, if you did not know that was today. And thank you so much for joining us for this special session of Coffee with an Expert. I'm the moderator for this session, Magazi Tyla, and today we're going to bring you a very thoughtful conversation about the world of heritage conservation and a person who is kind of pushing the field forward in a bold and innovative way. This webinar is part of an ongoing series created by ICOMOS Canada and in partnership with ICOMOS-USA that brings together leading voices from the many facets of the cultural heritage field, offering insight to any emerging professional or anyone passionate about the power of cultural heritage. So today we are honored to be joined by Monica Rhodes, a professional who is redefining cultural preservation as a global force for economic and social transformation, with her coined term of 50 years ahead. So Monica has led multi-million-dollar initiatives across 46 states and internationally. She's also the founding director of the Hope Crew. So that's the hands-on preservation experience crew that resides under the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a Rome Prize winner, a Harvard Loeb Fellow, as well as the founder of Rhodes Heritage Group. So we are incredibly excited to be with her today and kind of hearing from her experiences and kind of any advice she's willing to share with us. Just as a reminder, this session will run for 1 hour. And so we will start with a set of prepared questions and then kind of roll into an open Q&A with all of you in the second half. So please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to get to them as soon as we can. So with that, we can actually dive right in. So to start off kind of our first question and kind of introduction into that, you have over 15 years of experience in preservation, and we just gave a little bit of insight into your career with the introduction, but I'm pretty curious to know if you had any sort of initial interest in the heritage field, and kind of if that's changed, so how that journey has kind of looked for you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and hello everyone. Very nice to be here today. So my journey has been windy. So if you ask any professional in this space who's been here for a long time, where you started is not always where you end up. And we are all presented with these options in life where we do this and this. And so I came to this field by happenstance. So I am trained as a historian, undergrad history, master's in African American history. And it so happened that after I finished a master's and was the summer before entering a PhD program, I took an internship. That internship was with the State Historic Preservation Office in Pennsylvania. And the project was to identify and document African American heritage throughout the state, excluding Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So that meant I spent a lot of time learning about rural heritage. And that came from a Preserve America grant, which was a grant that was run by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And that opened up the door to the field of preservation for me. And so it was the way that I had been searching to be able to activate history beyond a textbook or beyond a documentary, because I knew as a historian, as a person living in the country, that history was all around us, but we didn't often have a chance to interact with it, engage with it, and really just sit down and have a conversation about our past. And preservation was the way for me to get to be able to activate history in creative ways. And so that was my entrance into the field. So I decided instead of getting that PhD that I would go and get another master's in historic preservation from UPenn. And I have been at it ever since, because it's one of those fields, as you all know or will soon learn, that has so many different ways that you can go, whether you're working in the government space, where you're in the for-profit space, whether you're storytelling, whether you're in real estate development, sustainability. There are many different paths that you can take in order to, figure out how does the past and what does the past mean to us in this current moment? And for me, the way that I do that is I lean on and love the power of story in connecting people, because as we know, some of those places that are so important no longer exist. And so that's where the conversations about cultural landscape and landscape architecture kind of help fill some of that void. So when I say this is ever winding, you know, have a moment or a time or an experience in preservation where your interest can grow and still be connected to something that's still very important to you. So that is a short answer for how I entered this field.
No, and as it should be in regards to kind of highlighting that it's a winding road or winding journey, because it's a very intersectional field, right? Like you mentioned, you could start from kind of sort of the other end of the spectrum and still find your way into cultural heritage. And we talked a lot about this with the EP committee as well, and the idea of like being an emerging professional doesn't necessarily mean you're like straight out of college either, right? Like there's
Right.
some people who get into the field and they're 50, 60 years old. So and they have a whole career before that. So it's definitely one of those fields where quite literally anyone can make their mark, and that's kind of like the beauty of it. So I'm glad that you shared that experience with that as well. And kind of moving into that, right? Now that you're at a place where you kind of founded your own organization, right, with the Rhodes Heritage Group, and I know within that you're also a trustee for ICOMOS USA, and then you just mentioned to me kind of in the pre-version of the webinar that you're also a part of the international group as well. I guess I wanted to know how you initially got into ICOMOS in general, and kind of how that's looked like for you as well with that same journey, right? If there are specific like committees or groups that you were into that kind of propelled you to becoming a part of the board.
Yeah. So I first learned about ICOMOS through graduate school. So learning about preservation and all of the layers. And that was the moment that I decided that I wanted to focus my career on the national and international space,
Mhm.
because for me, I saw that that is how I wanted to make the most impact. Although there are colleagues who work with the local, regional, or state level, and they are making deep impacts as well. So it just really depends on a matter of preference. But for me, graduate school is where I learned about it at UPenn in my policy class. And from there, I decided to join because I also had this curiosity of how and what conversations were happening in other parts of the world connected to this heritage discussion, right? Where does inclusivity fit in? Where does this conversation around climate action fitting in? Where is this conversation about accessibility fitting in to these larger national, international conversations? So that curiosity really piqued my interest, in addition to an internship that I had in graduate school in Montenegro, where I learned a bit more about how World Heritage sites worked, what the role of tourism in this space, the displacement that sometimes happens because of it. And so that was all very fascinating for me. Then I was a member for a while, and during COVID, I decided to become re-engaged, but not necessarily with the US's ICOMOS chapter. I got connected back up with Singapore, so they reached out and they asked me to join the Sustainable Development Working Group, and that was invigorating in all of the ways, because it was not necessarily new conversations, but new perspectives. And when you're doing this work, you always want to make sure that you kind of understand as much about an issue as possible. And sometimes that means looking outside of where you would normally look for expertise. Sometimes that means expanding the geographical boundaries of understanding to really ensure that you are holistically approaching and comprehensively understand a particular issue at many different levels, right? So that was exciting for me. So I did that for a few years, and then was asked to join the board of US ICOMOS as a trustee member. So I've been a board member for about 2.5 years now, and that's been really exciting. And last year, I was nominated and elected. Actually, it's 2 years ago. Nominated and elected to serve as a international board member for ICOMOS. So there are about 15 of us on that board, and I'm very happy to be in discussions with professionals from around the world, and also inspired by the work that we do as an organization. So whether it's culture, heritage, and connections with disaster recovery, when we're thinking about issues about it, is there, what are we doing about preserving the cultural artifacts that are on the moon? When we're
Oh
thinking,
gosh.
yeah, all of these things have come from the membership and the brain power that is ICOMOS, US ICOMOS, and it's been absolutely an honor to be able to engage at these different levels with different practitioners who are doing a multitude of things, all of which are listed on, or most of which are listed on our new website for ICOMOS, which I'm sure you will link to in our discussion. But those are the types of things that inspired me. It was a very people-first movement, and I ensured that when I was looking across the spectrum of organizations I wanted to align myself with, I wanted to think about where are there people-centered approaches that are prioritized and not as a secondary or tertiary strategy, and these last minute types of discussions. So ICOMOS was that for me.
Yeah, when the one area I would say I relate, especially for the people first portion you mentioned, that was definitely something that stood out to me as well. So I definitely want to emphasize that because, there are many obstacles I feel like in the field of cultural heritage, especially like bureaucracy and things like that. So yeah, not everything has to be or has, the luxury of being able to put the communities that you're kind of trying to preserve at the pinpoint. So I really appreciate you emphasizing that as well. And kind of with that, right, with the kind of journey that you've been on with ICOMOS and just in general with your career, I guess I wanted to ask, like, what are some of the biggest challenges you kind of faced within this field? And then what are some skills that you that resulted out of that, right? So that's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, I think in this field, and I'll speak at the national level. So what I'm seeing, and I'll touch on the international. What I'm seeing nationally with our universities is there is a decrease in enrollment in preservation programs, and I think that in some ways has something to do with the fact that we are, as heritage professionals, not uplifting the importance of the work or the things that we do, right? I think there's this public perception about what preservation is as this movement of no, that we can't, that we don't know how, we've never done. But the ways in which I've experienced this field and the incredible colleagues that I've had and practitioners who are working with that, it really turns that public idea on its head.
Mhm.
There are professionals across the country who are thinking innovatively, who are bringing in technology, who are centering people, who've done this as a matter of the way in which they work. And we haven't communicated that as an important perspective in this work, right? We talk about the buildings, we talk about, understanding the policies and all of that, but that going back to that people piece is what we don't
Mhm.
are we missing, and the utility of the work that we do, I think, contributes to the um, um, I want to say the lack of interest, but the challenge in recruiting more people into the professional field, right? So I think that's one of the issues that we have to grapple with, and looking at our curriculum as preservation education institutions, and thinking about what we and how we taught 30 years ago, does it align with today? Are we being thoughtful about how we are training this new generation of practitioners, and are we equipping them with the skills, the language to be able to go out and, instead of asking the right questions, but also being in community, in thought partnership, in respect with the communities that we say are important to us. So I think that's one of the reasons, one of the biggest challenges for me. And then the other one I would say, in addition to enrollment in programmings and messaging, and really tooting our own horn as practitioners is I think, our pay, what people are paid at the State Historic
Mhm.
Preservation Office level, looking for 10 years of experience, but only offering and wanting advanced degrees and only having a salary of $50,000. That is a problem. And it's a problem that we need to begin to start to think about and create some real solutions for if we're going to have professionals who not only just either they come into the field, we don't want attrition. We want people to be able to stay and build careers and knowledge base, and then bring along another generation, because we are stewards of this history, and that is important. And we should operate and pay at a level that communicates the importance of the work that we do. Now, that's a big, bold question, just like curriculum is a big, bold question. But these are the things that I'm seeing from my vantage point, that if we're going to be relevant, if we're going to have people who have an inkling of an interest in entering this field, then we have to get serious about grappling with these questions. And I know the National Council for State Historic Preservation Offices, they're thinking about this. I know the National Association of Preservation Commissions, they're thinking about this. And so these are conversations that are happening. And I am looking forward to hearing what our path ahead is as a field, as we work to close some of these gaps that we know exist.
Yeah, I will say I love the I had thoughts throughout the entire thing, but for the first point that you mentioned, I think it definitely makes me think about kind of my own journey as well. Just because, with my own winding path within cultural heritage and things like that, um it is something that I've constantly had on my mind, I will say. And then with the second point that you mentioned with pay, I'm also just kind of going through a flashback of all my journeys as well. Um, oh, and sorry, I wanted to also briefly mention this just came to mind. But with my own definition for anthropology, because I did study anthropology, I remember having to explain it over and over again to people and kind of what that means, what that looks like. And that, it's not just archaeology like Indiana Jones. So that's always a thing that happens. And with pay in general, I know that for myself, kind of with internships and other experiences that were kind of external, a lot of times it tends to be on your own time, right? On your own dollar, especially with archaeology and things like that, because it just tends to be a scenario where you need experience and people need help. So those are definitely 2 points that I'm really glad that you brought up because they will always be, I feel like, a part of the conversation that we have until, for millennias, I feel like. So it's yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up. And I will say with that, kind of thinking about both those points that you brought up, are there any sort of softer skills that you kind of come out of from like the journey you had so far, or even with these two obstacles that you mentioned, that you think emerging professionals would benefit from having now rather than it simply waiting for it to be built?
Yeah, I think you touched on that a second ago about explaining what anthropology is, right? So for those, I tell this to recent graduates all the time. It's like you chose a field, and as a history major, I chose a field that's going to require some hustle that comes with that. Like
Mhm.
there's no direct path like to into this work. You're going to have to figure some things out. So one of the, I don't know if this is a soft skill or we can call it a hard skill, but the importance of being nimble, of having some grit and some
Mhm.
hustle with you are important because not only you're going to encounter things that are going to make you scratch your head when you're in the field, but as you're looking at and trying to design the career that you want, you're going to have some questions, and there you may have one or two people that's like, oh, I like their career, I like what they're doing, but the question becomes, well, how do you get there? Well, the path between where you are and where you're trying to go, that's some hustle with that. That's some having the ability to be knocked
Absolutely.
down and have some failure, but not let that failure crush you or diminish your dreams, but understand that that's a necessary part of every single person's journey. There is not one person that I have ever met, self included, that has not failed or gone off course or had to course correct in some type of way. So, that is a soft and a hard thing to do at the same time. And so I, think it's important for people coming into the field to have a level of resilience, because the politics may not always go your way. The money, the budgets may not always want to go your way. Partners may not always want to go your way. And crumbling is not an option if the goal is clear and you're clear on the purpose of the reason why you're doing the project or why you're in the field, right? So those things kind of rise above that. So I would say that the clarity and purpose is a soft skill, but it's important to have, and being able to communicate the importance of this work, that going back to the messaging piece, and something that I think is also a challenge, and something that I think people who are coming into the field can help support is communicating the value of this work. I think we have issues with enrollment and the pay because we are often, as cultural heritage professionals, added to the conversation on the back end. And a part of that is we haven't demonstrated, to enough people, here's the value that we are bringing. So you will forever be a communicator if you are in this field, whether it's to your family, explaining these, but what exactly are you doing with your life, or whether it's a partner that maybe you're connecting with for the first time, who think they have some idea about what preservation is, but you're really working against perception, right? So those two things, those main things are my biggest pieces of advice about the soft skills that are needed in order to navigate the second decade of the 21st century as a heritage professional.
No, I think also these are amazing points as well, just because one, they all intertwine with each other, right? Like it's not really you only have one or the other. At some point, you will be using all of these soft skills if you are going to be someone who's successful in this field, especially with the fact that, like you mentioned, there's no one clear path. Like I can't mention how many times I've asked a teacher or a mentor, like, what do I do to get here? How did you do it? And they're like, I can't tell you. They're like, I don't know what is a right pathway for you specifically, because at that time, that's what made sense to me, and it may not make sense to you. So it's definitely making me reflect on, how exactly I've had to, I don't call them failures, we call them, diverting or pivoting, right? It's kind of like having that mental wording being different just so, you don't crumble like you mentioned, or you don't have those moments where you're like, is this for me? Am I doing this correctly? You're kind of just making sure you're pushing forward. So it's definitely another answer that's making me kind of reflect on the career I've had so far. So I really
Yeah,
appreciate your answers for this as well.
yeah, and I'll also add is like, engaging with people is often considered that soft skill. But if you've worked in this field, people and personalities and politics are all the things that make a project happen. And so I'm even pushing back against an idea of like soft versus hard, because you can't do one without the other. If you don't have trust and relationships, and you're not engaging with or in partnership with community, then your project is not happening, right? And so there's a both and I know the soft skill is more of the, what they call more like the mushy stuff, the
Mhm.
intangible things. But I think they're one of the most important things that we don't necessarily measure for, we don't think about as often, we don't pay as highly for. But those things are absolutely critical to doing anything worth doing, is being able to relate to people, to have that trust that's there in order to get this larger goal accomplished.
Oh, absolutely. And I definitely agree with the balance idea, just because I know there's so many technical skills you can get with, the cultural heritage field, and so many tools and resources that you have to learn how to use at some point. But at the end of the day, it all starts with being able to, connect and communicate with people, even if it's like someone who's at your university, or, an entire community that you're kind of walking into for ethnography, things like that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely hear you with that response in general, because it's something that I've had to learn, and I feel like unless if you don't think you've learned it yet, then you probably will find it in your future.
Yeah,
Um,
steering
so
a conversation with partners and trying to navigate stuff is probably one of the most highly technical things, because it requires emotional intelligence. And we don't spend as much time on that in the academy as we should, but it that's the root of everything.
Absolutely. So we're gonna jump into our last two questions because I don't want to go a bit into the overtime for any additional Q&A questions people may have. But for the first one that we have out of the two, so you mentioned in your introduction sort of leading projects within 46 states and kind of internationally as well. And so I did also take a quick peek at like your Instagram and noticed that you have a few heritage sites that you like were checking off your bucket list and things like that. So I guess I wanted to ask if there is a particular place or moment that sort of radically changed your understanding of like cultural heritage, whether that's professionally or personally.
Yeah. I wouldn't say radically changed. I think it gave me insight on the possibility, right? And that is a story that's at the very beginnings of my career during my time as a intern, as a Mildred Kolodny Fellow at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. That summer, they, along with many others around the country, were working to make Fort Monroe a national monument. And Fort Monroe is a historic fort down in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And at the time, the fort had gone through the base realignment process where the military moved out of it. The state of Virginia had taken over it and was trying to think about, what to do with this fort. And the Park Service had expressed an interest Congress had expressed an interest in doing a study to see what was the feasibility of Fort Monroe joining as a National Park Service unit, right? And so my job that summer was to figure out where were there connections between the fort and present day and how to galvanize that community in support of making Fort Monroe a national monument. And just a little bit about its history, Fort Monroe was the place in 1619 that enslaved Africans, something 20 and odd, came from Angola right there on the shores of the Fort Monroe.
Okay.
And it was also the place in 1863 where three African-American men showed up in a boat to seek their freedom from the tyranny that was the Confederacy. And before that time, General Butler, who was the general during the Civil War at the time over the fort, went against a long-standing rule for the military, which was to return formerly enslaved African Americans back over to the Confederacy. This time he made a decision, and it was called the contraband decision, to not return them back. And so they were able to stay inside of Fort Monroe, and word spread very quickly, as you can imagine, to other people in the surrounding area. And tens of thousands of African Americans self-emancipated and came to what became to be known as Freedom's Fortress, seeking their freedom. And so here you have the two chapters, the beginning and the bookend of slavery happening at one place. And from that, when freedom came, those individuals who were at Fort Monroe then created churches and organizations around that. And so
Oh.
my job then became to figure out what were those churches that were associated with the descendants of Fort Monroe, and if they were still active, and then to connect those churches to this issue, because they are the legacy of the people who had the vision and the bravery to emancipate themselves when the federal government, the state government, and local governments all said that because of your skin, you should be property. Right. So think about the bravery that was there to be able to make that decision. And so that there were 8 churches that had that connection, that legacy connection to it. And so I wrote a letter on behalf of those 8 pastors and spent a lot of time in church that summer, and ultimately to convince them to join the effort to designate Fort Monroe as a national monument. And it was successful, and also the first time that President Obama used his power under the Antiquities Act, which every president has from 1906, to create a national monument, because we know national parks are created either through national monument from the president or by Congress. And so that was that story there. But to me, when I was looking at that public meeting that the Park Service held, I saw all different types of people, standing in support of the importance of this work. And that was a light bulb moment for me early in my career that demonstrated that people, no matter what the background is, no matter how they come in or their thoughts, they could align themselves on the history and the heritage that was important about our country for us to remember and never forget. And so that's how I structured my career, not necessarily from a space of, I have to protect this knowledge, or let's talk in acronyms, or,
Mhm.
this field needs to be protected, or you can't do this. It's more or a conversation of how can we, and the more, the better. And so when I started the Hope Crew program, I started it from a perspective that American history belongs to us all, and we should all have an opportunity to engage, be a part of the preservation of these sites. And so it was an all hands on deck. So no matter who, joined on a cemetery cleanup or headstone cleaning day, so whether they were deaf or hard of hearing, whether they were a wheelchair user, whether, they were on either side of the aisle, no matter what organization they were in, political affiliation, didn't matter, that there was room for them to participate in together, because this is our nation's heritage, no matter what side we find ourselves on or how we feel about a particular issue. That matters not, because the site is still the site and the history is still the history. And we should have a chance to use the past as a way, or as a tool, and in some ways as a catalyst, to bring us together in ways that we normally wouldn't come together as a society. And so that was my aha, my light bulb moment, my view into the possibilities of the importance of this work, and how important it is for as many people as possible to be connected to the memory work that is the nation building that history and preservation allows us to do.
Well, one, I will say I've probably heard this a lot in regards to the story, but that was incredibly impressive. I don't think, I honestly have not heard of someone who's, pushed the president to use their power in regards to cultural preservation and things like that. So it's something that is just making me like gleam, I feel like. But yeah, no, I'd really appreciated kind of your elaboration on your story and kind of explaining it in the entirety, especially when you mentioned having to, be in church with the priest, like before we talked about communication and things like that. And even for myself, it's kind of I'm remembering because I started off my journey as well with like my community's church. So it's sort of, yeah, again, making reminiscent of that as well, and having to put in the work to be able to even talk to one person, let alone like the pastor or priest. Um I'm very happy that you're able to have that aha moment for something that is still so monumentous in your career, especially for someone like myself who's hoping to have sort of like, excuse me, I don't want to say the same um, effect, but to a similar precedent, right? So, yeah, I appreciate your response to that question, and then kind of that sharing that important memory with all of us today. And my last, second to last question before we go into kind of some of the questions I've set aside from people who are pretty excited about this experience that we were kind of setting up today. I know that you're known for moving like big ideas into action, especially what we talked about earlier with like the 50 years ahead sort of slogan that you have. So I wanted to ask, how do you stay sort of professionally creative, which you mentioned before, while also navigating, budgets, bureaucracy, kind of competing priorities and things like that? Like, how does that stay a focus of your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I know that, I have my own brand, and it's I'm saying I, but it's really a we and a us discussion that I'm having, right? Because nothing in my career would have been possible without partnerships from people who are aligned with the work that I thought was important, because we thought it was important to do that, right? As evidenced by that Fort Monroe example, when the room was filled with people from all walks of life. Or as I'm thinking about the work that I did with, on other national park service sites, it's still, there's there are organizations that are a part of that. So, There are ideas that I have, and then I find other people who are aligned with those ideas to be in partnership with me, in cahoots with me to achieve whatever goal that we deem together as important for us to move towards, right? And so that's important. And then when I think about like budgets and bureaucracy and priorities, like that's just projects, that's just people. And so I look at them less as constraints and more as a catalyst. And I see them more as kind of like design questions or questions of design. These are things that we have to resolve, right? So in order to get to X, I have to figure out, well, who have we not talked to if we have a budget deficit? Or if I'm thinking about, bureaucracy issues, right? What point, what lever should I push to bring in the right person? And I'll say, in my experience, whether it's, at the federal level with the National Park Service or the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, whether it's the State Historic Preservation Office, whether it's the local preservation organization, I have met some of the most collaborative people in my career. It's been my whole career, and that's the importance of kind of creating these partnerships at these different levels, because they're not looked at as challenges or competing issues, but when you get the right people in the room, then you're having a conversation on not if we can, but a conversation on how do we figure this out together. How can we think innovatively? When I've always valued having colleagues at different levels of their career because they're bringing perspective. So, having colleagues who are close to retirement can remember when they encountered something like this in the early 90s, and this is how we resolved it. Great perspective. When I'm having colleagues in their 20s and they're thinking about, well, here's what I think. Well, they're, bringing some innovation or some energy to it, that when you bring all of those generations together in one room, all of those perspectives at different levels, all of that diversity of thought together, then this becomes less of an issue and more of a design question that is solvable and figure outable, because we all in some self level have a clarity of purpose of what this project means. When we understand it's not just about this building or not just about this moment, but what the work that we're doing is about what's the future of this, or how are we communicating to future generations what we valued in this moment. And because that is the strongest message that you can send to a generation unborn, is what did we preserve, who did we value? And we do that by making decisions today and aligning ourselves both in partnership, with co-conspirators, to be able to advance the work that we all know is important in building a nation that reflects the complexity of who we are as a country.
No, I will say I keep saying this for all of them, but with this response, what kind of stood out to me was the idea of, for the generation unborn, like who do we say was important? What are we trying to preserve and why? That generally stuck out to me because I think that's the bottom line with all this, right? With the idea of balancing everything, because you can have, impulsive thoughts or feelings in the moment, but at the end of the day, it's about what is still going to be there when you're no longer there, right? What's going to be the remnants of your work. So, yeah, I really appreciate your response to this as well. And
Yeah, the other thing I'll just add is one of the other things I appreciate about, this field is there are people who will work on, that Fort Monroe project. There are people who got that project to where it is, right? And those most often are local people who say this place is worthy of preservation. Then there come your state folks, and then your national folks come in to do this work. Some people I will never meet that are connected to this story. Some people who come after, I will never have an interaction with. But that to me is the beauty of passing the baton along, is that I don't know the person that I got it from, but I know someone thought this place was important enough to preserve it, to, for me to then, help to be a part of this national monument effort, right? To then pass it on to someone who could envision a different future for it, or a new future for the use of the past, right? And so that is also the beauty of these big ideas, big actions, is that it's bigger than one person. Um, and
Absolutely.
and to me, that is like one of the most democratic American things that we can do, is to be engaged and be committed and active in putting ourselves in this lineage and legacy of this work of stewardship, of preservation, because we have a short time for the moment and the present that we're here doing this work, but we're building on what came before us, and we're leaving something for the generation that will come after, to carry on forward. So that's why this work is so important, because it's also communicating the values that we uphold and we think that are closest to who we want to be as a country.
100%. Yes. That's like the one word that I can use to describe what you just said. Yeah, it does make me think about the idea. I think that cultural heritage field is kind of one of the only ones that exist where being the first doesn't matter per se,
Yep.
because like you're setting the foundation, but there's always going to be something that's kind of evolving after you, that maybe could do something easier or do something in a way that made more sense right in that moment. So like it it is one of those things that kind of reminds me that it will always be a group effort and that there's nothing that can really evolve that will change that. So yeah, it's just one of those motivations kind of staying in regardless of like pay and other things that you're mentioning, like bureaucracy and things like that. Um, yeah, I think people are pretty shy in regards to asking questions, but I do have a few sort of set aside because I knew that myself and kind of the ICOMOS Canada group, and even people outside that were kind of excited about having you here today. So I'm going to ask a few of those. Um, I know we talked before a little bit about the idea of, what heritage sites or experiences were kind of very important to you. Um, just in a general sense, but I guess I also want to ask if there's anything sort of outside of what you mentioned prior that has been memorable from your work within this field, just in a general sense. Um, so I guess I kind of want to know a little bit more about your personal experience, but also with that, um, anything that didn't really push your career, if that makes sense. So just like a general memory about your experience.
Well, I'll talk about the work that we seeded with ICOMOS Canada, with USA and also to Mexico, and that's our underground railroad work, right? And so there's this when people think about the Underground Railroad, folks are automatically thinking about like people escaping slavery, right?
Mhm.
And then going to Canada, or if you were in Mississippi or Arkansas or Texas, you were trying to make your way south because Canada was too far away. And so when I think about the work that's important, it's always been creating these linkages, this binational story of something as innovative as the Underground Railroad. Like we think that we have a understanding, nationally of what that was with codes and things like that. But I'll tell you, we are at the very early stages of understanding the complexity that people were able to communicate across country, across boundaries, across borders, to put people away
Mhm.
from the tyranny of enslavement. So whether it was, someone leaving the plantation initially, but then there was a network in order to get them fully away and fully into safety. And that's the role, the conversation we were having with Canada, and we look forward to continuing, because that is a story that we can tell both with our sites that we've done here, that we know connects even tighter or more with the stories that are being told in Canada, right? And the same goes for our conversations in Mexico. So that's something that we are currently working on, that we want to continue to partner with ICOMOS Canada and ICOMOS Mexico on, because these broader stories, connects us not just in the past, but in this present moment, as we are focusing in on binational communications beyond. This is, bigger than the current moment, but it's how do we articulate the fundamental importance of the freedom story and the freedom journey, and what are the places that are left that we can talk about that tangibly, and what do we know about the places that are no longer with us, that we can also have a discussion around the intangibility of those important sites that may not be here. So that's something that's currently happening. It inspires me because we're telling a more comprehensive story than what we've told in the past. Like, it's just not an American story, the business of the Underground Railroad. It's a North American story. And I think the more that we could find opportunities to collaborate, which I know colleagues in Canada are looking forward to doing, and colleagues in Mexico, the more we could tell a deeper, more nuanced story of the complexity that was the Underground Railroad. So that's something that's both inspirational, and it's not something that that happened a few years ago. This is what I'm engaged with and I'm working on now as a U.S. ICOMOS trustee member.
Yeah, well, one, thank you for sharing that with us. I think this with conversation in general and just like what you mentioned with this response is especially with the idea of, sites that might not be there, when we're gone or are currently being erased and things like that. It is making me think of like the current climate and everything just with administration. And so this work is extremely important just because I know I've had similar issues in that regard for, history kind of being erased or, what does it mean for institutions that, before were playing that part and, at this time can't, kind of having to adapt with that conversation. So, yeah, so I appreciate that work that you're doing with them and hopefully that will kind of result into something that, I don't know, hopefully, ends up on, a website or some sort of web page that will be here, for the Internet Archive to take care of. So it can be here for that new generation.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah.
think the other thing is important to remember is, like, preservation is the long game, right? Like, the moments things happen, that is to be expected. There are these ebbs and these flows that happen. But when I say, preservation is about thinking 50 years ahead, it's like, how do we align our thinking? How do we align our organizations, our institutions to create the future that we want to see 50 years from now? So that's that long vision that we have to have as practitioners as we are entering this work, because we can't always be in response mode to the current moment, because we also have to hold space for the ultimate reason as to why we're doing this, which is a future we haven't experienced, or a future some of us, I won't live to see the next 100 years, right? But that doesn't mean that I don't understand the critical importance of the decisions and the projects and the partnerships that I have in this moment in setting the course for a future unseen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is something that I'm trying to, currently practice myself, especially as I, enter new spaces and kind of take on new leadership roles and things like that. So it's um, continuous conversation. I will say that, and it will probably continue until I'm long gone.
Mm.
So yeah, so I appreciate your thoughts on that as well. That kind of plays into my next question. It has to do with any trends, or even tools or resources that you kind of see that are currently shaping the heritage kind of conversation. And that could be within any sort of subsect or, facet of heritage work. But I guess I kind of want to know more of your thoughts about how that looks like right now, or what you're kind of seeing that you're like, this could be something that overtakes within the next, 10 years.
Yeah, I will say that what I'm seeing and what I've always seen in this field, and we don't get credit for, is our innovation and imagination, right? Being able to, with these budget constraints, with you, as we know, no matter what what administration we're under, arts are not always as prioritized. Like, when there are budget cuts that happen, at the city level, state level, arts,
Definitely.
and it's one of the first things to go, right? But even within an environment like that we've been in for a while, we still have been able to accomplish a lot, right? So that's that innovation that it takes to say, well, I may not have the funding, but I can create a collaboration or a partnership with another institution that if we put our resources together, then we can move the needle in this way. I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for the innovation that it takes to be able to do what we do, even when so many people don't know what it is that we do, it's still happening. And so that to me is worth us leaning into and not forgetting as we are these new tools, AI comes along, VR and AR are growing. It's like we've already been innovating and imagining, and now we have these tools to help us do that in a different type of way. So it's not just, full recalibration. It's looking at this in from a different vantage point, right? We have always had imagination to think about what could be when what's in front of us is a building that's falling down or roof that's missing. And, with money and some innovation, a few years later, that building is open for tours, or it's reopened as a cultural center, or reopened as a revenue generating property that's then contributing to how people understand the ongoing use of a particular thing, right? So we have that within us, and so that's what I see, and I think that we should lean more into that as we are heading into a future that we've never been into. We have more tools at the tip of our fingers than we did 10 years ago. And so those are important. I'm seeing opportunities in the VR and the AR space for folks to lean in on. There is an app now funded in part through Mellon Foundation by an organization called Kinfolk, where you're
Yep.
able to have that augmented reality experience by holding your phone up. But again, AR, shows us where we are in a world. And that's that technology piece. But that imagination and innovation piece as heritage practitioners is we are creating that, we are preserving that world. So for there to be a Frederick Douglass figure that's brought up on the phone, well, it has to have a backdrop to something, right? It's pulling information from the house that is preserved in DC, from the work that we've already done. So those things are in conversation with each other. And we should never forget, as we are leaning and reaching towards the new, what we already have and what we have done to build an infrastructure for these tools to jump off from. Right. So I think there will be more tools that will roll out in the next 5 years that we don't even know about yet. But I will caution, as we are seeking the newness, it's important for us to pause and also remember what we've done to create a foundation for these sites or for these apps to be built from, for these things to be realized. Our work is even more important as stewards, as memory workers, to be able to ensure that we're preserving these things in the real world, so people can also experience them in the metaverse.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the balance of sort of you're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but trying to push the needle to invite more people, be more inclusive. Like I know with Kinfolk, it's essentially bring like the museum to you, right? Or those heritage sites to you. So it's very, very cool because I geeked out over it, a couple months ago when I first downloaded it. But it's, that idea of making cultural heritage more accessible, but in a way that still makes sense to people. So I'm glad you brought that up because it is something that I've thought about since I've, kind of discovered the organization, and the team there, Hanessa and Idris, they're amazing. So yeah, I'm excited to see where their work goes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you brought up the point of making sure that we understand the foundation as well, because especially as someone who initially, like when ChatGPT and things like that came out, I was kind of like, what are we doing? Like, where are we going with this? Because, there was a whole idea where people were saying, well, you no longer have to like think or write or, kind of those things that make us more human, right? Or push innovation. So it's definitely a conversation that I'm also having with friends and family and kind of arguing with them as well. So I'm glad you brought up that point.
Yeah,
Um,
just many tools to choose from, right? And they're all so new. But again, we have a knowledge base. We have infrastructure as a field, as at the international, national, state, and local levels. We have this scaffolding that's there that we've built. And the question would be, how do we get technology to fit in and be in conversation and not in competition with that? Because we, will have to figure out and imagine, how do we wield these tools to be in benefit and in service of the work that we know is important, rather being in competition or in contrast to. So I think that is the question that we will have to answer very soon, as a field, is how do we integrate and partner in these discussions, rather than pushing them off, or just saying that they're too different or in contrast to what we believe.
The idea of pushing the preservation into the future, to go back on some of the words that you've mentioned before and kind of articles and things like that. So yeah, so thank you again for your time with us. We are wrapping up a little bit, in a little bit, because my all the questions that I have been answered, and I don't want to take up any more of anyone's time for this hour. But I do want to thank you again so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day, out of your month, to sort of schedule this with us. So yeah, so did you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, not at all. This is National Parks Week. So for those who are not able to get to a national park, at least try to visit a website, to retweet about it, reshare it. I don't know if people say retweet anymore. But there are great things that are happening. And I think it's important to uplift and identify, then uplift those things that are underway in our preservation ecosystem, because there are incredible professionals that are behind that work, and incredible programs and people. So make sure to keep an eye out for those efforts that are ongoing.
Absolutely. And for our audience, we really appreciate you guys coming out today and kind of your thoughtful questions for the ones that were on the side for today. And whether you are just beginning your journey in heritage or continuing to grow in the field, we hope that this conversation has sparked, new ideas, has answered any questions you may have about what your experience could look for you, or even just reaffirmed the importance of the work that you do or hope to do. So if you're interested in more conversations like this, please keep an eye out for other Coffee with an Expert sessions on the World Heritage USA EP LinkedIn. We also have Monica on there as well, kind of linked from our promotionals for this session, but we also will be doing a follow-up post, so please keep an eye out for that as well. So until next time, everyone, please stay curious, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.